More than 3,000 years ago, in the land of Egypt, a robust and handsome boy was born into the home of an Israelite man and woman. In a different time, the child's parents would have rejoiced at the birth of a son. Yet at this time, the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, and the king of the land, the Pharaoh, had issued a terrible decree that all boy babies born to the Israelites must be drowned in the Nile River. Now God had led the Israelites to Egypt hundreds of years earlier when a great famine had ravaged their own land. And the man who was Pharaoh at the time gave them the best grazing land in all of Egypt, in a place called Goshen. But when he died, new pharaohs came to power who feared the strength of the many Israelites and enslaved them. For a generation, the Israelites were forced to labor under the burning sun as builders and bricklayers. And for a generation, they cried out to God and prayed for a liberator who would lead them out of Egypt. On that morning when the boy was born, Pharaoh's terrible decree had already taken effect, and the Israelites suffered more than ever. Yet this one woman resolved to save her son from Pharaoh's soldiers, for her heart would break from sorrow if harm were to come to the child. She hid the boy in her home for as long as she could, but after 3 months, she was unable to conceal him any longer. So one night, while the whole city slept, she sat by the light of an oil lamp and wove together a basket of bulrushes and dabbed it with pitch. And in the early morning, while the stars still shone in their places, she laid the boy in the basket and handed it to her daughter Miriam. Miriam ran to the place where Pharaoh's daughter, the princess, bathed each morning. She placed the basket among the bulrushes and hid behind a palm to see that the child would be safe. As the mist rolled over the river, Pharaoh's daughter appeared on the bank. The first thing she saw was the basket among the reeds. "Fetch me that basket," she said to one of her maidservants, who scurried down the bank and came back with the basket. The princess peered inside. "This must be an Israelite child," she said. Her voice awakened the sleeping boy, who began to cry, and Pharaoh's daughter took pity on him. "I will take this child and raise him as my own," she announced. And because she took him from the Nile, she called him Moses, which means drawn out of the water. So the years went by, and Moses grew up in Pharaoh's court, surrounded by silk and sandalwood and roast of meat and fine spices from the four corners of the land. He grew strong and tall, and his tutors taught him to read and write, and his bearers bathed him in lavender and rosewater. Yet with time, Moses came to know that while he lived in luxury, the Israelite slaves labored in the fields and were treated no better than beasts of burden by the Egyptians. And in his heart, he was troubled.
Moses, lead your people out of bondage.
One day, when Moses was a grown man, he went walking beside the brick pits where the Israelite slaves toiled.
So much pain and so much suffering at the Pharaoh's hand.
He saw his people, their mud-stained bodies bent and twisted from the weight of their bondage. He saw their agony in their faces and the welts on their backs from the lashes of their Egyptian masters. Finally, when he saw an overseer beating an Israelite, he could bear the injustice no longer. In a rage, Moses flung himself on the overseer and killed him.
So much pain and so much suffering at the Pharaoh's hand.
Then he buried the Egyptian in the sand and ran home. The following day, Moses learned that many people knew of his crime and that Pharaoh sought to kill him. So Moses removed his silk robes and cloaked himself in a coarse wool garment. And that night, he fled Egypt on foot. He traveled by the dim trace of the moon.
Moses, lead your people to the promised land.
And for several days, he walked alone through the hard wilderness of the Sinai. And when finally he reached the distant side of the desert, he felt safe and rested there in a place called Midian.
To the promised